Thank you so much for inviting me to join you here at the Economic Times Women's Forum. I've been a virologist and a public health specialist for a really long time. And somehow, in all of the work that I've done in public health, one thing that has become incredibly clear to me is that the role of women in health is underappreciated. There was the title of a WHO report that came out a little while ago, which summarizes everything that there is to say about public health, and particularly at this time. And that report is titled Delivered by Women and Led by Men. If we look at the workforce around the world, and particularly in India, what you see is that women make up the bulk of the healthcare workforce. And this is not just in the delivery of healthcare, but also in the development of tools that are used in healthcare. So if you look at who are the people who work in health, you can really divide them into people who are paid to deliver healthcare and who are unpaid. And if we look at home healthcare workers, provision of healthcare at home to children, to parents, to families, that really is the role of women, and that is never considered when we think about healthcare. So if we think about the challenges of what women have undergone recently in the healthcare space, obviously those are a lot, but they are amplified by all the other challenges that women have in society. If you look at sociological challenges, obviously job losses, the increase in requirements of domestic care, of the unpaid care that is required is huge. But if you look at even behavioral challenges, there are huge differences in how men and women have handled what they have had to undergo. In terms of looking at behaviors, for example, smoking and alcohol, which are predisposers for more severe disease, are more common among men. If we look at behavioral interventions that we have been asked to participate in, like washing hands, it is actually recorded that women wash more than men do. And it's possible that that can influence infection as well. If we look at aspects of health and safety, many things have changed in the last few months. If we look at what happens to women, pregnant women in particular, they have lost access to healthcare systems. Antenatal coverage went down, home births went up. And the complications of what has happened because of the shutdown is something that we will be able to measure only in the future. Additionally, other new problems have arisen or been amplified. If we look at women who work in healthcare, one of the first early challenges that was faced in terms of safety is that personal protective equipment is not designed for women, it's designed for men. So we had to rethink how this was used and had to be made for the future. Now, if we look at other issues that women undergo, domestic violence and the consequences of domestic violence that are seen in the healthcare system have certainly increased a lot. Now, if we look at disease, infection and disease that is caused by SARS coronavirus 2, here again, we see a lot of differences in terms of gender. We know that infections in men and women happen at the same rate. But if you think about severe disease, then severe disease is really something that seems to be happening to a greater extent in men rather than women. Now, why is this? Part of the reason appears to be hormonal. Women have sex hormones. Estrogen is the primary one. And estrogen plays a large role in cardiovascular disease. But specifically in the case of SARS-CoV-2, we found that estrogen appears to lower the amount and that can lead to women having lower cardiac complications when they are infected. immune systems of women are different from that of men. Because of pregnancy, women are used to having babies and being able to protect themselves and their babies from infection. In the case of SARS-CoV-2, it's been found that women actually make a much stronger neutralizing antibody response than men do, and that the subclasses of IgG that are made by women are ones that are more protected. So overall, it appears that while infection rates may be similar, the responses to the infection that result in disease, that result in subsequent immunity, are different in men and women. It's also been proposed that there may be other genetic differences because women carry two X chromosomes and therefore have more genes that encode immune responses, and that the microbiome, which is the gut flora that lives in our intestines and may modify our responses to infections, not just of SARS-CoV-2, may be different between men and women and result in these differences that are seen in disease. Now, what will this really mean for vaccines? When we think about vaccines, we've always had a one-size-fits-all kind of approach to vaccination. When you've decided that a group needs to be vaccinated, we give them vaccines, and we have a government program that rolls out the vaccine. The idea of vaccine supply being limited is not something that people have thought about before. And the fact that vaccines should be given to different strata of society, different susceptible groups, is not one that has been thought about before. There is a lot of hype about what is happening in terms of being able to protect ourselves in the future from SARS-CoV-2, and vaccines are seen as a key to the exit strategy from this pandemic. Well, one thing I think it is important for people to remember is that the first generation vaccines that we will get are not going to be the vaccines that we will have for a very, very long time. They are not going to be the perfect vaccines where anybody who gets the vaccine is protected after the first dose forever. It's not even that everybody who gets the vaccines will be protected. When we think about what success will look like for a first generation vaccine, what the WHO, what the regulatory agencies in the West are asking for is a vaccine that protects at least 50% of people from severe coronavirus disease. And that means that even if you get the vaccine that performs at that level, 1 in 2 people might not actually be protected from infection. So it's not like you can get the vaccine and then you have a certificate to go back to life as normal. That is extremely unlikely to happen. So people need to understand that where we are today in terms of what we are practicing as measures to prevent infection will not stop once we have a vaccine. Now, with all the vaccine platforms that are being developed right now, we don't know which ones will be successful. We don't know when we will have them. It is likely that we will have indications of whether certain kinds of platforms are going to work well or not as clinical readouts by the end of this year or the beginning of 2021. But having those clinical readouts, again, does not mean that the vaccine will be available for everybody immediately. What will happen is that we get the clinical readouts, the trials will need to continue so that we have sufficient long-term follow-up of the individuals who are vaccinated, and the vaccine companies will ramp up manufacture. When manufacturing is approved, the vaccine is licensed, we're going to start with having tens of millions of doses available. It's not going to be in the hundreds of millions. It's not going to be in the billions immediately. So we need to think about when vaccine is available, who should the vaccine be given to? There is a lot of money power in some parts of the world. The US has already committed to buying more than 800 million doses of vaccine, which is more than enough to vaccinate their entire population twice over. So even with 2-dose vaccines, they've got enough for themselves, assuming that what they have committed to buy will be a successful vaccine. Now, that is the US. Not every country in the world has the resources to be able to make so many bets on different kinds of products. But for the rest of the world, there is a mechanism that has been established that is looking at making vaccines available to people who really need them as early as possible. This is part of what has been established by the WHO and partners as the ACT Accelerator. ACT stands for Access to COVID-19 Tools, and the vaccine component of that is called COVAX. It is a facility where countries sign up to participate in a global allocation mechanism. So a lot of donations from richer countries have been made in order to be able to purchase vaccines that can then be distributed to other parts of the world. The goal of the COVAX Accelerator is to have at least 2 billion doses of vaccine, and then to provide that vaccine to countries that need it the most. The decisions on who will get the vaccine, the global allocation mechanisms, are being made by the WHO, and the WHO has been working with partners to decide what the process for prioritization should be. What the WHO has come up with as a draft, which continues to be in various stages of discussion for refinement, is that the first priority must be healthcare workers. It has estimated that healthcare workers make up approximately 3% of the workforce of each country, and therefore 3% of the population should look at being vaccinated as the first part of the first phase of supply of vaccines. Now, following healthcare workers, there are people who are particularly vulnerable in different populations, and these people are the elderly and those with comorbidities. In certain countries and locations, there are additional vulnerable groups, and these could include people that live in remote locations, tribal populations who are uniquely susceptible to disease, as we have seen with the indigenous populations in the Amazon basin, as well as more recently in the Andamans. So it's estimated that approximately 20% of the population of a country will constitute that second group of vulnerable populations that need to be immunized. WHO estimates that the 2 billion doses that it is committed to finding and delivering as quickly as possible will cover 23% of every country's population, and the first priorities for allocation must be first the healthcare workers and then the vulnerable populations. Now, if we think about India, India has decided to participate in the COVAX facility and the allocation. So if the 2 billion doses become available to WHO, we will have access to them. But India is also uniquely positioned in being the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world. The companies that we have, Serum Institute, Biological E, Bharat Biotech, already have multiple vaccines that have been pre-qualified by the World Health Organization and therefore are in use in over 100 countries in the world. It is hoped and planned that when vaccines become available for SARS-CoV-2, Indian manufacturers will be prepared to make those vaccines. There have already been agreements signed with multinational manufacturers by Serum Institute and by Biologically to make vaccines in case they are found to be successful in phase 3 trials in other parts of the world. If that happens, then some of the vaccine platforms will allow for our manufacturers to make the billions of doses that are required for our population and for populations around the world. India really has a platform where our vaccine industry can deliver now, as it has done for childhood immunizations previously. But as I said, while all of this sounds potentially good, we don't know which vaccines will be successful and therefore whether we will have the platforms to make them. And we don't know how long protection induced by a vaccine will last. If we think about coronaviruses, we already know a great deal about seasonal coronaviruses, the ones that cause the common cold. And as we know, you get a common cold really quite frequently. So will this behave like seasonal coronaviruses, where you have short-term protection after infection? We don't know that, and we are currently tracking people who have been infected with SARS coronavirus 2 to look at how long protection lasts. Recently in the media, there have been reports of people getting reinfected and a subset of reinfected people having symptoms the second time around. This is not the end of the road for vaccines. This happens. Some people do not make protective immune responses after infection. This is not common. It is something that is rare and is thrown up when you have lots and lots of people who are infected. So overall, while I don't think that vaccines are likely to be a cure-all for all infections or all disease, I think vaccines hold out a lot of promise. We will have way more information about 6 months from now, but we need to be planning what we will do with those vaccines, what are the distribution mechanisms we need to set up, how will we make sure that 1.3 billion people can be vaccinated within India in a reasonable time frame when sufficient supplies are available. And there are, of course, lots of opportunities for innovation there. But in terms of duration of protection, which vaccines will work, there is still a lot for us to learn. And before we have all the information at hand, the one thing that we do know is that infection prevention works, and we need to make sure that we continue to educate people on the importance of preventing SARS-CoV-2 infections. Thank you.